In the previous video, we talked about how a tax would alter a consumer's budget constraint and ultimately their optimal decision. Could have a tax on individual goods, which alters the price of that individual good. You could also have a type of income tax, right? And again, we said in this type of simple model, we didn't have much of a role for that tax revenue, but we could create kind of more complicated models which do have a role for that tax revenue. We could redistribute it, might be able to use it to subsidize one of the goods, so on. All right. So if you're interested in a little bit more complicated analysis of the role of taxation in these little models that we presented in 306, then I think the actual course number changes from time to time, but there's like a public economics type of course that you can take, 425. There might be one at the 300 level too. I'm not exactly sure. Okay, so we're going to move on and talk about how tax impacts the producer. And these analyses relied on the cost structure of the industry, which we basically just said we have some sort of marginal cost, which is eventually increasing. We have some total cost, and we don't see it here, but we've got some variable cost, and total cost would have the same. They would be parallel, and the distance would be fixed cost, average fixed cost. Right, so just sort of a review. I think that was about chapter 6 when we started introducing the cost curves. And what we're going to say here is that if there's a tax on the producer, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to increase the marginal cost. So if the tax is on the producer and says, all right, for each unit you produce, you have to pay this amount of tax. Right, so we've got the marginal costs just of production, your labor and capital costs if you produce one more unit. But then if you produce one more unit, you also have to pay this tax as the producer. Okay, so in general, the tax on the producer is going to impact the cost curves, and this could ultimately impact the producer's short-run decision to produce Q star or shut down. And it could also impact the long-run decision as well. So, here what are we seeing? Originally, supply is going to be marginal cost above average variable cost for the competitor. So there it is. We see that the price at that point is above average variable cost. Then we have this increase, this tax, which affects both marginal cost and average variable cost. All right, it'll affect average total cost too, but it's not on here. Would it affect fixed cost? No, because fixed cost doesn't depend on quantity. Okay, so you have tax in the market, which changes the costs. And in this particular graph, the producer would produce, right? MC price equals MR. So MC equals MR occurs above variable cost at Q1. And also now after tax, we have this MC MR, which is above the new average variable cost. So in this case, the producer would still produce, but the idea is if you had a tax that was big enough to put the average variable cost plus tax, like say up here somewhere, then the producer would shut down after the tax. Okay, so generally speaking, again, the tax for the individual producer alters the individual producer's marginal costs. So just sort of a quick numeric example here. Suppose total cost is 500 plus 2Q, and the government wants to reduce the quantity of single-use plastics in the market, so it introduces a per unit tax of 1/2 or 0.5. How does this impact the firm's cost structure? Well, again, the per unit tax just acts as an increase in marginal costs. There's no Q term in fixed cost, so fixed cost won't be impacted by the tax. The tax says for each additional Q you produce, you have to pay this 0.5. Right, so here's our total cost, fixed cost 500, plus now our marginal costs are 2 plus 0.5. All right, so here's fixed cost times plus variable cost gives us our total costs. So again, why might or might not the producer or the government want to implement this tax on the producer? We know ultimately, right, this is going to be a supply shift to the left, and then we can kind of go back to the beginning, and a supply shift to the left is going to, all else equal, result in a higher price and lower quantity, and that might have some drawbacks. So in this example, the government wants to reduce single-use plastics, and the result is that we might have some higher prices, lower quantities in the market, reducing consumer surplus. All right. In addition to attempting to limit quantity in markets where there might be some sort of environmental damage, like single-use plastics, the government could also act to reallocate the optimal choice of firms' input use. So in chapter 6 and 7, we studied the producer's problem, and we found L-star and K-star, and we didn't really think about any distribution or welfare impacts of that choice. But it could mean, in reality, if we're suggesting that the producer optimally use, say, more K and less L in some optimal ratio, in reality, that means potential job separation or people losing their jobs. So in our model, we just sort of think, okay, here, suppose there's been some changes. Here's our original budget constraint and our optimal quantity isoquant here at point A. Suppose we have some sort of changes where over time capital required becomes a little bit less expensive. Maybe we have some updates to our computers and machines, but labor becomes relatively more expensive. Maybe you have some increases in wages. So not to say that that generalizes to every market, but there could be some examples of that in reality. And our models just suggest that the producer optimally uses more of the relatively cheap capital and less labor. And again, this could result in, I don't know, do we have the same people working less hours, or do people get fired? What's the actual welfare and distributional impacts of that? Right, so our models don't really have a whole lot of consideration of the welfare and distributional impacts. And so I just sort of wanted to call the attention to the fact that classical economics doesn't really usually consider this question, and it just leaves it for discussions in classes like philosophy, ethics, in the business school, business ethics and law, those types of classes. But we do in the department have some expanding fields in economics in general, which are also taught in the department, like environmental economics, and then the public policy types of courses, which I referenced before, which would also probably address these distributional impacts and concerns at a greater detail. Right, so again, I just wanted to kind of note that as we're going through and kind of recapping the models that we've done in this class, we also kind of want to consider what might be the distributional or welfare impacts of our predictions or suggestions. Right, so in the next video, we'll talk about do we want government intervention? When might we or might we not want government intervention? And we'll talk about how the particular market structure, ranging from perfectly competitive to monopolized, might impact that choice.